So this is everlasting life. They're taking in knowledge or coming to know you. Who's the you? The only true God. Ton monon, the only. Alethinon theon. True God. The only true God. Explicit teaching of both the Bible and, of course, Jesus, who is speaking according to the Bible. And of the one whom you sent forth, Jesus Christ. So there's a distinction here. There's a difference between the only true God, the one he's talking to, right? The Father, right here, verse 1. And the one whom he sent forth, Jesus Christ. So Jesus himself, speaking to the Father, describes him exclusively, ton manon, as the only true God. Form of manos, manon. That's how Jesus describes the Father. And then he separates himself from that only true God. It's really simple, isn't it? I mean, I'm kind of breaking it down because even though it's so simple, Trinitarians reject it. Everett Commodore, thank you very much. Super chat. We always recognize that. And thank you for your support and enthusiasm for what we do here. We have to break this stuff down, even though it's so simple, right? There's really no controversy in any Bible that you use, right? Other than taking in knowledge or knowing you. That's, I've already talked about that. I'm not talking about that, though, here. I'm talking about this part and this part, right? There's no issue there. There's no Bible that makes that confusing. Yet we have to break this stuff down for Trinitarians because they reject this teaching. And then they give us so much grief because we actually believe what it says, right? Word for word. It's like 1 Corinthians 8:6. It's like word for word, our primary doctrine. One God the Father. There are those who are called gods, just as there are many gods, many lords. I said you are gods. Jesus quotes it in his own defense. Right? He's not quoting a text that refers to false gods to justify him being a god or God. All right, it's an arthrous theos used there, and clearly the use of Psalm 82 shows they're accusing him of being a god. Another mistranslation in all these English Bibles in John 10:33. And yet they give the NWT grief, right? Clearly, John 10:33 should be translated a god. They recognize he's claiming to be a god like the sons of God, and that's exactly what he responds with. Justification for being a god as one of the sons of God. Yet Trinitarians can't figure that out, right? They don't even understand what the text is talking about in Psalm 82. They think it's calling Israelite human judges gods. Now, Israelite human judges are never elsewhere called gods. The entire book of Psalms repeatedly refers to the angels, the sons of God, as gods. Another example, again, is Psalm 8:5-6, quoting Hebrews 2:7-9. I've done a whole video on this subject. And the sons of God, the gods in Psalm 82, were recognized as spirits that God was coming against, just like Jesus said in John 10, in the Melchizedek scroll. So our beliefs, our understanding is all within the Bible, on the biblical period, and supported by how people during those periods interpreted these texts. The Trinitarians are next. They cannot make the same claims. So this text is so clear, is it not? Again, just like 1 Corinthians 8:6, one God the Father. You, Father, the only true God, and the one whom you sent forth. Separation, distinction, just like in 1 Corinthians 8:6. One God the Father and one Lord Jesus Christ. No, that doesn't mean the Father can't be Lord in any sense, Trinitarians. Just like it doesn't mean the Son can't be God in any sense, Trinitarians. He just can't be God in the Trinitarian sense because that's not what is taught in the Bible. The sense in which the Son is Lord is the sense in which God made him Lord, Acts 2:36, Philippians 2, 9 through 11. This is all biblical stuff. They can't figure it out, right? Because their doctrine won't let them. It's blocking them. It's preventing them from seeing the truth. Just like it did Jesus' enemies, the Jews of his day, the religious leaders, right? Not all Jews. They couldn't get past their tradition. Didn't matter how smart they were. They were blind. So this text is of the most simple kind, is it not? No controversy, no problems. Very clear and straightforward. There's nothing at all here that's a problem unless you believe in the Trinity. Then there's a big problem, right? Then you have to explain this away somehow to try to show that the Son and the Holy Spirit are also the only true God, which is directly in conflict with what Jesus says here and what we're taught elsewhere, like in 1 Corinthians 8:6. Let's talk about what it means to be true in the Bible, right? I've talked about how just because the Father is called the only true God doesn't mean the sons of God who are called gods are false gods. Trinitarians they don't have any other way to deal with this. So they say, oh, well, then is the son a false God? No, he's one of the sons of God who are gods according to God and the Son of God. Why don't Trinitarians see that? Because they don't believe that and they're blind. Their doctrine won't let them see it, everybody. Okay? So don't get, you already know, you've been dealing with these texts and with Trinitarians for a while, you already know how this can go. Don't let yourself get caught up too much with them. They can't see it. Right? They don't want to believe it. Maybe some of them someday, right? You want to give a witness and at least plant some seeds, but don't waste your whole day. They'll suck up your life and they don't care. They're not interested in the light. They want this later stuff. They prefer Constantine and Athanasius and all that stuff. Okay, that's what they want. They don't want this teaching. They've got to work for them. So we've talked about, right, and I've done videos recently in this series and outside of this series that show very clearly how the Bible uses the term God exclusively in one sense for the Father, but that in another sense, the sons of God can be and are gods without being false gods. The Trinitarians just won't accept that because then they couldn't believe in the Trinity, right? This is the whole problem with their understanding texts like John 10:33 through 36. If they just understood Jesus' whole argument there, right? He actually addresses the very question we get into arguments with Trinitarians over right there. Right there in that text, he's accused of being theos. And he answers them and explains how it's okay because others are called theoi. Completely destroying arguments from people like Robert M. Bowman Jr. and others that claim you can't use a plural when discussing the application of a singular theos for Jesus. Jesus does it, okay? I think we're in good company. I think that's okay. I think that's a good argument, Rob. And that's what you Trinitarians should be doing, not contradicting Jesus and those who argue like him. So let's take a look at a couple texts. Let's go to John. Now, the text in John will be the most relevant, right? Because we're talking about a text in John. But we'll look at a couple texts outside of John as well in the New Testament. Let's talk about true, right? The only true God. What does that mean? We just talked about how it doesn't mean that every other God is false, because there are others who are called God or gods, like Jesus and the sons of God, who are not false gods because they represent the one God, the true God, right? So how could they be false gods? They're really gods. They're really spirits, just like God. Hebrews 1, John 4, 1 Corinthians 15. But they're not acting as individual gods on their own with an independent will and teaching. It's all representing the Father at all times, everything. They realize that's the way to be. That's the God to be. And God lets them be that. over and over and over again, like I talked about in the last two parts to this series. The angels in the Old Testament speak and act as and are directly addressed as God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, called the divine name. They're the ones speaking for God in the burning bush, on Mount Sinai. We know that for sure. Acts 7 tells us that. John 5 tells us no one has seen or heard God's voice at any time. John 1:18 tells us no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who's in the favored position with the Father, has explained him. These are all consistent with the presentation of one God the Father, the only true God, and the sons of God, not as false gods, but as actual spirit gods who represent the one God. They reinforce his godship. They don't take away from it or conflict with it like the rebellious sons of God do, like the God of this world does. John 1. So let's take a look at this use of true, right? Alethinos. We just described, and I've talked about in other videos, how it does not make everything that's not described as true false. So what exactly is it teaching? What does it mean? John 1:9 says, the true light that gives light to every sort of man was about to come into the world. All right. Now, we know, right, from Genesis chapter 1, from just our own experience, that there are many real lights, right, literally and figuratively. People can be a light, something that shines understanding or makes things clear. There are actual lights that make us see, allow us to see things. The light that comes from the sun, the light that comes from artificial sources that we've created. But they're not all the same lights, are they? They're not the true light. There's a sense in which Jesus is described here as the true light, in which other lights, other real lights, they're not false lights. There's a sense in which every other light is not like him. Is that not clear from that text? If not, what else would it mean? What else would it mean if it doesn't mean that Jesus is the true light in a way that all other non-false lights are lights? They're really lights. They're not false lights. They're just not light in the ultimate sense in which Jesus is here described as the true light. Let's go to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 32. Hence Jesus said to them, most truly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father does give you the true bread from heaven. Right? So if you look at the context, verse 31, our forefathers ate manna. He gave them bread from heaven to eat, just as it is written. So was the manna false bread, Trinitarians? Just because Jesus says that he's the true bread? Right? Jesus is making a direct contrast between the bread Moses gave them that came from heaven, from the Father, and the bread that he is from heaven, from the Father. Right? So obviously the manna is not true bread in the sense that he is. That's his whole point right here in describing himself as true bread. He's not saying the manna is true bread. He's saying the manna is not true bread, right? Because that's his whole point. The manna that your forefathers ate is different from what I am. They had bread from heaven. It was really bread. It wasn't false bread. Did the Father give the Israelites false bread, Trinitarians? That would be the logical conclusion from the way you argue at times about true God in John 17:3. No, it's simply making the point that Jesus is bread in a way far better than the manna, right? That's obvious. Just like it's obvious to people who don't believe in the Trinity that in John 17:3, when Jesus says the Father is the only true God, that doesn't make the other gods that both Jesus and God say are gods, and that Jesus argues are gods in his own defense. It doesn't make them false gods. It makes you false believers. It makes you worshipers of a false God and lying about the others who are called gods in the Bible so you can promote your doctrine. That's what it does. That's what it means every time that you're confronted with John 17:3 and you claim that if the Father's the only true God, that would have to make Jesus a false God. That just shows you don't worship the God of the Bible and you don't understand what the God of the Bible and the Messiah of the Bible teach about others who are gods without being false gods. Just like there is bread other than the true bread that's not false bread, or light other than the true light that's not false light. It's just not light or bread in the ultimate sense of which the thing that is said to be true is. John 6:55, very similar text here. My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Does that make every other food false, Trinitarians? Does that make every other drink false? Again, just like with the manna and verse 32, and the bread, the true bread, versus the other bread that's not false bread, it's just not the true bread. No, it means they don't have the same quality. They're not of as high of value. They're not the ultimate food or bread or drink that Jesus or his flesh or his blood is. Exactly the same thing that it means in John 17:3. The Father is the only true God, the one who is God in the ultimate sense that no one else is. But that does not mean that his own sons who represent him and who are spirits just like him are false gods. That's a false teaching by those who believe in a false doctrine called the Trinity. We realize there are some people who believe in the Trinity who are nice and don't always want to engage us and call us heretics. We're not, we understand some of you are just misled. Read the comments in the description of the video below. We get it. We understand there are a lot of Trinitarians who are well-meaning, right? You just want to try to serve the God of the Bible. You've been misled. You're confused. You've been beaten down with the threat of heresy in your traditions. We understand. And we sympathize with you. But you're surrounded by people who teach false doctrine. Your leaders, your pastors, your scholars, the ones who know better or who should know better, but who don't know better. And it's as simple as we're describing right now. John 15:1. We're talking about the meaning of true in relation to the only God who is true. The only true God, I should say. The only one who is God in the truest sense in which the Father is the true God. John 15. This is Jesus talking. Right? This is all Jesus talking, except for John 1:9, right? With the light, that was John talking about Jesus. Trinitarians don't believe him. They don't believe him in John 10:33 through 36. They don't believe him in John 6:32, 6:55, or here. Right? Unless they're going to start to understand what true means and stop misleading other people into thinking everything else has to be false that's not true. They don't understand the way true is used in the Bible. They think it's like talking about a dichotomous statement. Like if this is true, then that's got to be false. That's not how it's being presented or is presented at all. At least not in these texts or in John 17:3. Because we already know that the sons of God are gods in a non-false sense. Both God and Jesus say that. Jesus uses the fact that the sons of God are gods to defend himself. It would make no sense whatsoever for him to defend himself against the accusation he called himself theos by using a text that called others false gods. Right? Do you see how ridiculous Trinitarians get? They would have us believe Jesus is quoting a text that either refers to human Israelite judges and then has no application at all, right? Because that's not how they understand him to be God or theos in that text, John 10:33. So why would he quote a text that refers to human Israelite judges if the sense in which he is God in John 10 is different than those human Israelite judges? And of course, it's not talking about human Israelite judges. We proved that contextually in the video I did about the gods of Psalm 82. The Melchizedek scroll shows that was not the belief of the Jews during the time right before the New Testament. And it doesn't make any sense for Jesus to argue using a text that calls human Israelite judges gods or false gods gods. That does not support his argument or claim to be theos at all. Either one of them. The only understanding of Psalm 82 that Jesus quotes in John 10, 34 through 36, 34 is when he quotes it, but he talks about the text more. The only understanding of Psalm 82:6 that he quotes in John 10 that in any way supports the way in which he is theos is that it's talking about the sons of God as gods. Right? Because it's not talking about God at all. So he quotes a text that doesn't even involve God other than that's who's talking to the gods, right? But he's using the reference to the other sons of God as gods to legitimize his claim to be theos in John 10. So there is no understanding that would do that unless it's the sons of God, the spirits, as gods. They're the gods against whom God's word came. He went into the council of the gods, Psalm 82:1, and he said, I said, you are gods, Psalm 82:6. They're called gods all throughout the book of Psalms and in other texts. So Jesus is a son of God. The only context and category into which he fits is that very category that he quoted, and the only understanding of that category that makes any sense is that he's talking about them as actual gods, right? They may be gods against whom God's word came, but they're not false in the sense that they don't exist, that they're not really gods. If he's quoting a text that only refers to them as false gods, that does not legitimize his claim to be theos. He would have to be quoting a text that is parallel, you understand, with the accusation being made, unless he's just going to reject that he's theos at all, which he doesn't do, right? He legitimizes the claim by quoting a text that uses the plural of theos for other sons of God who are. There are gods. Trinitarians just don't understand what that means or how anybody can be a god in a real sense unless you're the true God, because they believe in the Trinity. Trinity won't let them. It won't let them, everybody. Jesus provides the best example right there in John 10 of how to understand others as gods besides the Father, not as false gods, but as really existing gods who either do or don't do God's will. In the case of those gods who didn't, in the case of him who did. He right there presents the best way to understand and explain that to everybody in his own defense over being called theos. And Trinitarians still don't get it. Incredible. I am the true vine and my Father is the cultivator. Trinitarians, is Jesus being the true vine? Does that mean there are no other vines that are true? Or it doesn't call him the only true vine, but are you saying that the vines like your grapevine in your yard is the same kind of vine as Jesus? Right? We already know that he contrasted himself with the manna in the wilderness. And he also contrasted his flesh and his blood with other food and other drink. So you don't need only there to make the point, because he's making a contrast that the manna is not true bread. That's his point. If the manna is true bread, then why would he then contrast himself with the manna as true bread? He wouldn't, right? That's the whole point. The manna is not true bread. So is the manna false bread? No. Well, he's the true vine. Is he not more truly the vine than any other vine? It doesn't make those vines false vines just because they're not the true vine in the sense that Jesus is referring to himself. Again, we see this consistent use of true, alethenos, that shows that not everything else that's not alethenos is false. It's just not true in the sense that the thing being described as true, is really that thing. It's that thing in a way nothing else that is that thing is. It's superior in the way that is described. Hebrews chapter 8. Continuing our discussion of alethenos and what it means and why it doesn't mean that everything that's not alethenos is false, the way Trinitarians often argue falsely to support their false doctrine and reject the true doctrine that the Father is the only true God. Word for word, biblical teaching, Son of God. John 17:3, one of our two subject texts. We'll get to 1 John 5:20 next. Hebrews 8:1. Now the things being discussed, this is the main, as to the things being discussed, this is the main point. We have such a high priest as this, and he has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, at the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Talking about Jesus, a public servant of the holy place and of the true tent, which Jehovah put up and not men. Now, I don't agree with the NWT's use of Jehovah here. I've talked about it. It's in my books. Right? I believe it's superior by far than every other Bible in both the Old and New Testament when it comes to the use of the divine name, at least recently, right there. I think there are a couple translations that may in the past have only used it in divine name quotations in the New Testament, but that are well known. But there are some times where it uses it based on context or an understanding that I don't think is legitimate to do. Either way, that aside, you can see part 1 in my moral and translational superiority of the NWT for more on the use of the divine name and why I believe it's still superior in the NWT, in spite of some of the uses like here, where I don't think it should be used. But it describes heaven as the true tent. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a public servant of the holy place and of the true tent. Right? Or maybe New Jerusalem, right? The tent of God. It may or may not be the same thing as Revelation 21, but it certainly, in this context, appears to relate to heaven, a heavenly tent. Not an earthly tent. Right? It goes on to talk about rendering sacred service in a typical representation and a shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses, when about to make the tent in completion, was given the divine command. Right? So it's contrasting the heavenly tent with the earthly tent. And it calls the heavenly tent the true tent. So just like with the manna in the wilderness, and Jesus being the true bread. And so that's not what the manna is. It doesn't make the manna false bread. It's just not true bread in the sense that Jesus is. Same with the tent. The earthly tent is not a false tent, Trinitarians. It's just not the tent that the true tent of heaven is in the same way and to the same extent or quality. The true tent is superior. It's a tent in a way that the other tents are not. Hence, it is true in a context in which they are not. Same thing with John 17:3, which I've explained numerous times in connection with other texts which call the sons of God gods, which both God and Jesus accept, and in Jesus' case uses in his own defense. Not because they're false gods, But because they're gods who represent their Father, no one more so than in his case, and he, in the case of Psalm 82, has appointed those sons of God as gods over the nations, as real existing gods, just as there are many gods and many lords, 1 Corinthians 8:5, but there's to us one God, the Father. So the sons of God can be and are gods, just like Jesus and the Father tell us. The Son of God is a God who was in the beginning with the God, and the only begotten God, John 1:1, John 1:18. He, like the other sons of God all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, can be and does act as and is spoken to as God. John 20:17, 20:28, part 20 of this series. It doesn't change the fact that the Father is our God. When Jesus is our God, it's because we recognize him as the Father. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. You think I'm doing this on my own? You think I'm telling you my own words? No, it's the Father. The Father's in me doing his works. See part 20 for more on that. Because he's the true God, Trinitarians. That's why Jesus says those things. He's the one who's only God in the true sense that Jesus said he was God, and that none of the other sons of God are, so he works through them. They do what he says. They listen to him, they learn, and they express his teaching. In Jesus' case, he gets a whole revelation from God the Father in Revelation 1:1 that he didn't have before. And as the archangel, as the ruler of the angels, is one who communicates information, that's what it means to be an angel. He gives that information to one of his angels. So he's not only by definition an angel, and shown to be the archangel as the ruler of the angels. 1 Peter 3:22, all angels and powers and authorities were subject to him. They're his angels. He's explicitly called an archangel in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. There's no way out of that text, no matter how pathetic of an argument Trinitarians want to try and make. I did a whole video about that too, part 7 of Jesus and Michael as the Biblical Archangel series. So we once again see here clearly how the word alethinos is used. 1 John 2:8, a couple more texts here. 1 John 2:8. Again, I'm writing you a new commandment, a fact that is true in this case and in yours, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. This kind of goes back to John 1:9, once again shows that you can be true in a sense that other things that are not false are not. It doesn't make them false. It just means that the thing that is said to be true in contrast with those that are not is different, is of a higher quality or type. And then you have Revelation 3:14. I quoted this earlier regarding Jesus being, of course, the beginning of God's creation. But it calls him the faithful and true witness. And yet we know, according to texts like 3 John 1:12, that's 2 John, 3 John 1:12, it says, Demetrius has had witness borne to him by them all and by the truth itself. In fact, we also are bearing witness, and you know that the witness we give is true. Right, so even here, you have the witness by others being described as true, and you have Jesus as the faithful and true witness. And here's kind of an example of what I'm trying to describe with regard to the Father's the only true God, and how at times when I say when Jesus is God to us, or when the other angels are God to us, they're not their own God, right? We're not acknowledging them individually like Thomas did as some separate God. We're acknowledging them as the true God. That doesn't make them the true God. They represent the true God in that instance. When they are talking to us, whether it's the angel in the burning bush, whether it's the angels on Mount Sinai, whether it's Jesus in John 20, they are the true God to us at those times. Or the angel in Revelation 22, all throughout the book of Revelation, right? Talking for God and for Jesus. So here you have others whom the Bible says their witness is true. Does that make them the same faithful and true witness that Jesus is? No, he's obviously superior and the true witness in the ultimate sense that no one else is. But when we imitate him, right? When we act like him, or we're told to put on the Christ, we're told to be the Christ to other people. That's the same thing, only to a different degree, that we're talking about when we say that the angels speak as God or spoken to as God are the true God without actually being the true God. You see what I'm saying? Their witness is true, but that doesn't make us Jesus if we give a true witness in imitation of what he does as the faithful and true witness. We represent him. Again, the degree is different, right? We're not perfect angels, so we can't do it to the full extent that they can represent the Father if he lets them, if he gives them authority, right? If he puts his name in them, which he does. But this is a way you can understand how our witness can be true. Jesus is the faithful and true witness, but that doesn't make us Jesus, right? We're just imitating him, and so by imitating him, our witness becomes true. In the same way, when the sons of God represent or imitate or speak for their Father, not themselves, not their own will, not their own teaching, nothing of their own initiative, like Jesus says over and over and over again. It's like one of the most repeated teachings of his in the New Testament. It's because he's representing that true God to us in the same way that we represent him, but to a different degree, as I said a moment ago. All right, so now that we understand this meaning of true, right, I think that's pretty clear. I think it's very clear that in the Bible, alethenos does not, when it's applied to one individual, either with terms like only, exclusively, or in a way that is exclusive according to the context, right? Like when Jesus is the true bread. There's not other true bread. He's contrasting himself with other real bread that actually came from heaven, manna, and is effectively saying that's not true bread because it doesn't do what I'm going to do as bread, and that's give you everlasting life. I'm true bread, right? I'm better than that bread, even though that bread is not false. Just like Jesus says, right? The Father is greater than I. The Father is the true God in the sense no one else is. He's greater than everybody. That's why Jesus said that. It is also consistent with the teaching of Origen when it comes to God and how the Father is God in a way that no one else is. This is from Origen's commentary on John, volume 9 of the Ante-Nicene Father series, published by Hendrickson, page 321, or actually, I'm sorry, 323, on the top right column. Here, Origen quotes Jesus. Well, first he says, we have to say that God on the one hand is very God, autotheos, God of himself. And so the Savior says in his prayer to the Father, that they may know thee, the only true God, but that all beyond the very God is made God, temporal distinction, by participation in his divinity, and is not to be called simply God with the article, but rather God without the article. Here, Origen gives one of the earliest understandings of the significance of the Greek article in John 1:1, where you have the Father, the only true God, he's called the God, in a context where Jesus is just called theos. It doesn't mean that the Father can't be called theos without the article, or that the Son can't be called God with the article. It means in the context in which they're presented and contrasted with each other in terms of theos, the article is significant. One is the God, the other is a God, one of the sons of God, whom God and Jesus said are gods. And thus the firstborn of all creation, who is the first to be with God. This is Origen, right? This is pre-Trinitarian stuff. Trinity was not yet fully developed at this point. There were some false teachers and liars, and Origen didn't get everything correct. But even he understood this, and Origen was pretty good in many respects, but not everything. Here, though, he's making complete sense, right? There's nothing he's saying here that's inconsistent with what the Bible teaches. It's inconsistent with the Trinity, though. The firstborn of all creation, who is the first to be with God and to attract to himself divinity, is a being of more exalted rank than the other gods beside him, of whom God is the God, as it is written, quoting Psalm 50, verse 1, according to the footnote. The God of gods, the Lord hath spoken and called the earth. It was by the offices of the firstborn that they became gods, referring to the other sons of God. This is why Jesus is the only begotten God, just like Jehovah's Witnesses and we teach, right? Jesus is the firstborn of all creation, the first to be with God, a being of more exalted rank than the other gods, beside him, of whom God is the God. Quotes the Bible, the God of gods. It was by the offices of the firstborn they became gods, for he drew from God in generous measure that they should be made gods. The firstborn was directly created by God as the firstborn. Then, just like Origen is teaching here, through the firstborn, the other gods were made gods. For he drew from God the Son in generous measure that they, the other sons of God, should be made gods, and he communicated it to them according to his own bounty. The true God, then, is the God, with the article, and those who are formed after him are gods, images, as it were, of him, the prototype. This is exactly what we believe, right? It's what we've been telling Trinitarians for centuries, depending on which group we're talking about, right? And they act like our teaching is just some, thing that Arius came up with later. We're all Arian. Well, then Origen was an Arian before Arius even existed, right? The Trinitarians are so ridiculous in the way they try to just dismiss our beliefs and arguments that are 100% based on what the Bible teaches and consistent with other people who lived after the Bible was written teach, like Origen. It gets exhausting, right? Trying to explain to them again and again and again these very simple things. And then they throw out terms like polytheism and henotheism that came about far later, don't completely contain exactly what the Bible presents, and that are more consistent with what they believe as well, right? Because even they accept, like I talked about in part 20, lower deities like Satan, right? Satan is the same nature as God. He's a spirit. God is a spirit. So there's no difference in the nature. We're humans. We're flesh. There's no difference in any of us. We're all flesh. We're all humans. When Jesus became a man, he became flesh, just without sin. So the Father is the ultimate spirit, right? The uncreated spirit who gave birth to all these other spirit sons. They're all gods by nature. Some become false gods in the sense that they rebel from God and they don't teach the truth. They teach lies, what is false. Some gods don't really exist, like idols. They're just pieces of wood or metal or stone. That's not what Jesus is talking about in John 10, though. He's talking about real sons of God who are gods, just like he's a God, only he's approved, and they were opposed by God in Psalm 82, even though he said they were gods. And they are gods. And we're made lower than those gods, who are identified as angels in Hebrews chapter 2. Now let's go to 1 John 5:20. I think we've established very clearly what John 17:3 is teaching. The Father is the only true God. There's no controversy about what it says there in terms of translation. the understanding of true according to the Bible does not make everything else that's not true false. It just makes it something other than what is true, of a lower kind, consistent with Jesus' own teaching that the Father is greater than him. 1 John 5:20. But we know that the Son of God has come, and he has given us intellectual capacity that we may gain the knowledge of the true one. And we are in union with the true one by means of his Son, Jesus Christ. This is the true God and life everlasting. Now, there are a couple things going on here, aren't there? First, let's deal with this last part. This is the true God and life everlasting. Trinitarians love to misinterpret this verse because they see that Jesus, his Son, Jesus Christ, is the last referent. So the way they read it and interpret it, they associate this description with what immediately precedes it, as if that's necessary or even required. And it isn't, right? Just look down at 2 John 1:7. For many deceivers have gone forth into the world, persons not confessing Jesus as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So if we take the way Trinitarians understand 1 John 5:20 to mean that just because the immediately preceding antecedent is Jesus Christ, then that makes him the true God. Then Jesus is also the deceiver and the Antichrist. Because the same thing in 2 John 1:7, Jesus is the immediately preceding antecedent. Iesun Christon erkomenon en sarki, hutas estin aplanas kai hai antichristos. See, they only care about their doctrine, everybody. They don't really look into the text to see how these words are used, how hutas is used. It does not always refer to, and even in the context of John's own letters, does not refer to the immediately preceding antecedent. So actually, if you use the use of hutas in 2 John 1:7, then you'd have to say that it would show this is probably not what it's doing. Now, the fact is, it shows that that's just not how, that alone is not how you determine who's being described in the following verse. The context is what does that, right? Just like you'd have to look a little beyond the immediately preceding antecedent to right here to understand what's here, because the sense of what is here described in the last part of 2 John 1:7 clearly fits the earlier referent, does it not? Trinitarians get sense and reference all confused when it comes to reading their doctrine into the Bible. Elsewhere, they do a great job, right? They love interpreting the Bible and using all these biblical principles of interpretation. But when their doctrine is at issue, they just fall out the window, right? It's like they lose all comprehension of any ability to properly understand the text because they have to. They don't have anything in here that establishes their doctrine. They're kind of forced into these ridiculous ideas and arguments. So that having been established now, what is this talking about? Okay, well, it says the Son of God has come and done what? Given us intellectual capacity, right? Understanding, that we may gain the knowledge of who? The true one, right? That's what it's talking about right here. The true one uses a description very similar to the true God. That we may know, a form of gnosko, just like in John 17:3, right? This means that this is everlasting life. They're coming to know you. They're taking in knowledge of you, the only true God and the one you sent forth, Jesus Christ. This is everlasting life. The gnosko. Right here in 1 John 5:20, it does something very similar. It associates gnosko with the true God and with his Son. But look at the way it does it, right? It calls the true one, right? It uses alethenos as a noun, the true one. And it also serves as an adjective when it's qualifying another noun like theos. But it uses it on its own here. It substantivizes it, turns it into a noun, the true one. We are in the true one by means of his Son. En to huio autou. To huio autou. The Son of him. Right there, we know that the true one here and here is not the Son. Because the personal pronoun, his Son. Whose Son? The true one's Son. So even Trinitarians realize the true one in those two references right there of 1 John 5:20 is not the Son because of the reference to his Son. The only referent to that his could be to is the true one. Everybody understands that. So it's talking about who's the subject here? Well, the Son of God has come, we know that, to do what? To give us an understanding so we can gain knowledge, gnosko, of the true one. And we're in the true one by means of his Son. This is the true God and life everlasting. Now, if you take the true God out for just a moment, what does it say? This is life everlasting. Estin, zoe, ionios. And yet in John 17:3, the text that we started out with, how did it describe the life everlasting there? Estin, he, ionios, zoe. Gnosko. Gnosko. Coming to know. This is everlasting life. Coming to know the true God and his Son. That's exactly what it says right here. We gain the knowledge, the gnosko, of the true one by means of his Son. This is everlasting life. Gnosko, the true God, and the one he sent forth, Jesus Christ. John 17:3. This is the true God and everlasting life. Gnosko and the true one. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Gnosko is the life everlasting. Jesus is not here described as life everlasting. This text is basically a summary of John 17:3. This means this is everlasting life. Gnosko. You, the only true God, and the one whom you sent forth. The Son of God has come, given us an understanding, so we gain the gnosko of the true one. We're in the true one by means of his Son, Jesus. This is the true God and life everlasting. Who's the true God in John 17:3? The true one, right? The Father. If it's his Son, if the true one, right here and right here, If Jesus is the true one's son, then the true one here and here is who? The Father, right? This is the true God. The true one, whose son is Jesus Christ, is the subject here. He's the one the Son came to give us the gnosko that Jesus said is everlasting life. The gnosko of the true God and the gnosko of the Son who came or was sent by him. The true God is the subject of this verse, which is the true one, whose Son is Jesus, and life everlasting is the gnosko of the true one and of his Son Jesus, just like life everlasting is the gnosko of the true God and Jesus in John 17:3. Trinitarians, though, get confused because all the way back to the start of John, 1 John, First John 1:1 and 2, it says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have viewed attentively and our hands felt, concerning the word of life. Yes, the life was made manifest, and we have seen and are bearing witness and reporting to you the everlasting life which was with the Father and made manifest to us. Now, what did John 5:26 say that we read earlier? Just as the Father has life, so he has granted to the Son to have life in himself. The everlasting life which was with the Father has that life and was made manifest to us. The Father gave the Son to have the same life, or to have life in himself. It's not talking about eternal life, at least with respect to the Son, right? Because he's given it. Everlasting life. It really doesn't call Jesus everlasting life here. It associates everlasting life with Jesus because it's talking about the life that was made manifest, right? The life that Jesus brought into the world that the Father gave him, that the Father put in him, John 5:26, and was made manifest. So Trinitarians like to claim that Jesus is actually called everlasting life here, Ionios Zoe. He's really not. He's associated with everlasting life here for sure, right? Because the life that was made manifest was with the Father and then made manifest here. He's the word of life, right? That's what it's talking about in verse 1. What we heard, what we've seen, what we viewed, the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen, are bearing witness and reporting to you, the everlasting life which was with the Father and made manifest to us. So you could say that's a reference to Jesus as life. And I'm not against that understanding. It just doesn't explicitly call him that here, the way I think Trinitarians sometimes try to argue. But again, in John 17:3, what else is called everlasting life? Gnosko, right? It says explicitly, this is everlasting life, coming to know you, the only true God, and Jesus whom you sent forth. It doesn't call the Father or Jesus everlasting life there. It says everlasting life is coming to know them. In 1 John 5:20, it does the exact same thing, just using different terms. Son of God has come, given us an understanding that we may gnosko the true one. We're in the true one by means of his Son. This is the true God and life everlasting. I don't think it's calling God or Jesus everlasting life here. I think, like in John 17:3, it's associating life everlasting with gnosko, with the knowledge of the true one that the Son of God came to give us. That's what he explicitly says is life everlasting in John 17:3. So why would it be any different right here? And we also get a reference to the true one and his son, and the true one whose son is Jesus, so he's the Father as the true God. It seems to me to be summarizing and restating exactly what we're told in John 17:3. That life everlasting is coming to know God and Jesus, which we do right here because Jesus came to give us the understanding so that we would have a gnosko that is everlasting life of the true one. And we're in the true one by being in his son. The true one clearly relates to the true God, does it not? I mean, you have two antecedents, two prior references to the true one, right? Alethenos used as a substantive. And then you have the true God referenced. We're talking about his son and the gnosko that we need of both of them to have everlasting life. It seems to me to be a restatement of John 17:3. And everything in 1 John 5:20 is pointing to the true one as distinct from Jesus, his son. And just like we saw in 2 John 1:7, hutos does not directly refer what it introduces back to the immediately preceding subject. There's no reason to do that here, especially since the true God, alethenos theos, much better refers back to alethenos, right? Ha-alethenos, the true one. The only reason we have Jesus referenced in the context of the true one and the true God is because he's the one who came to give us the gnosko of the true one. And we're in the true one by being in his son. And since hutos does not always introduce what immediately precedes it, or further describe what immediately precedes it, it much better contextually refers to the true one and the Father whose son is Jesus.